The night Lord Ashford destroyed his daughter's future, he was wearing his finest coat. That detail would stay with Alina for years, the gold buttons, the careful knot of his cravat, the way he had kissed her cheek before leaving for the evening and said, "Don't wait up, my dear." She had not waited up. She had gone to bed believing she was the daughter of a man who, despite his many failings, still possessed one thing that could not be gambled away. She was wrong. Before midnight, her father had sat across a card table from 3 different men, and before the candles had burned down, he had promised her hand, her life, her name, her future to each of them. Not once, not twice, 3 times, on the same night, in the same room, while she slept upstairs, entirely unaware that she had become the most valuable thing her father had left to lose. None of the 3 men who won her told her what had happened. Only one man who had been in that room told her the truth. He was not one of the 3. And he had nothing to gain from telling her and everything to lose. This is that story. The card game had not been Lord Ashford's idea. That, at least, was what he told himself as his carriage rolled through the fog toward Viscount Harley's townhouse on the evening of the 14th of November. It had been an invitation, a friendly gathering, a small table, men of similar standing. There was nothing suspicious about it. There was nothing to fear. Lord Ashford was very good at telling himself things. The truth, had he chosen to look at it plainly, was somewhat less comfortable. The truth was that he had owed Viscount Harley £4,000 for 11 months. The truth was that 2 other creditors had begun sending letters that were no longer polite. The truth was that Ashford House, with its tall windows and its portrait gallery and its 30 years of carefully maintained reputation, was quietly drowning, and Lord Ashford had been bailing water with a teacup for longer than he cared to admit. But the coat was fine. The cravat was perfect. And so he stepped out of the carriage and told himself, one more time, that the evening would go well. It did not go well. The room where they played was small for a viscount's house, deliberately so, Alina would later understand. Small rooms meant fewer witnesses. The fire was high, the wine was generous, and the 4 men around the table had known each other long enough to be dangerous in each other's company. Viscount Harley sat at the head. He was 51 years old, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become merely commanding. He wore no expression that could be easily read, which was, Alina would come to learn, his greatest talent. To his left sat Mr. Gerald Pemberton, 30 years old, well-dressed in the way of a man who spent more than he had, with quick eyes and a smile that appeared precisely when it was useful and disappeared just as efficiently when it was not. Across from Pemberton sat a lawyer named Griggs, who was not there to play cards. He was there to represent the interests of a third party whose name would not be spoken aloud that evening, a detail that should have alarmed Lord Ashford considerably more than it did. And then there was James Calloway, seated slightly apart from the others, near the window. He was there in his formal capacity as Harley's secretary, present to take note of any agreements made, to ensure the evening's business was properly recorded. He was 28 years old, the second son of a Shropshire clergyman, and he had been in Harley's employ for 14 months. He had seen things in those 14 months that had taught him to keep his face very still. He kept it very still that night. Lord Ashford lost the first hand within 20 minutes. Then the second. Then, with the particular momentum that belongs only to men who cannot stop, he lost the third, the fourth, and the fifth in quick succession, until the number written in the small leather ledger that Harley kept at his elbow had grown into something that made the fire feel suddenly less warm. It was Harley who leaned back in his chair at precisely the right moment and said it quietly, almost kindly, the way one might offer a drowning man a rope that happened to have a hook in it. Ashford. Let us discuss Eleanor. Lord Ashford looked up. She is 22 now, I believe, Harley continued. Accomplished. Well regarded. An asset to any household. He paused. And you have very few assets remaining. The room was quiet. The fire crackled once. Lord Ashford said nothing for a long moment. Then, and this was the part that James Calloway would never entirely forgive, no matter how many years passed, Lord Ashford picked up his wine glass, took a long drink and said, "What are you proposing?" Harley proposed a simple arrangement. The debt, all £4,000, would be cleared. Immediately. No further letters, no further pressure, no solicitors. In exchange, Lord Ashford would formally promise his daughter Eleanor's hand in marriage. A contract quietly drawn, signed before witnesses. Nothing public until Harley chose the timing. Lord Ashford agreed. James Calloway, at the window, wrote it down with a steady hand and hated himself for it. The second promise came an hour later. Lord Ashford, relieved of his largest debt and perhaps made reckless by that relief, had continued playing. Pemberton, who had said very little all evening, had been watching with the patience of a man who had been waiting for a specific moment. When Ashford lost again and again, and again, Pemberton set down his cards, straightened his cuffs, and smiled. "I find myself in a position to help," he said pleasantly. "The sum is not insignificant, but I am a reasonable man. I ask only one thing in return." Lord Ashford, who had already given away his daughter once that evening without apparently registering the weight of it, gave her away a second time with barely a pause. Pemberton accepted graciously. James Calloway turned a page in his ledger and kept writing. His handwriting did not waver. This, he would later tell Eleanor, was the thing he was least proud of in his life. Not that he had written it down, but that his hand had not shaken while he did. The third promise was the strangest. Griggs, the lawyer, had waited until well past midnight. By then Lord Ashford's relief had curdled back into anxiety. The wine was wearing off, the numbers were becoming real again, and he had begun to understand dimly that the evening had not gone as planned. Griggs presented a document. He did not name his client. He said only that the client held a separate claim against the Ashford estate, a land dispute, long unresolved, which could become very public and very damaging should it proceed to court. Or it could be settled quietly. The mechanism for quiet settlement was, again, Eleanor. Lord Ashford signed. He was home before 2 in the morning. James Calloway watched his carriage leave from the window, and then stood alone in the emptied room with a ledger full of his own careful handwriting, and thought about a young woman asleep in a house across the city who had just been promised to 3 different men by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect her. He thought about it for a long time. Then he closed the ledger, set it on Harley's desk, and did not sleep at all that night. Eleanor woke the next morning to pale November light and the sound of her mother's footsteps in the corridor, quick, purposeful, the kind that meant something had happened. She dressed without hurrying, because hurrying had never yet changed anything, and went down to breakfast. Her father was not at the table. Her mother poured tea with slightly too much care and said, without looking up, "You may be receiving a caller today, Eleanor. Perhaps more than one. I ask that you be pleasant." Eleanor looked at her mother's hands. They were perfectly steady. "Pleasant," Eleanor repeated. "Yes. May I ask why?" Her mother set down the teapot. "Your father is managing some business matters. That is all." It was not all. Eleanor had lived in this house for 22 years, and she knew the precise texture of her mother's silences, which ones meant nothing, and which ones meant that something had already been decided, and she was the last to know. This silence had the second texture. She drank her tea. She said nothing further. She watched her mother's face very carefully. And somewhere across the city, James Calloway was sitting at his small desk, staring at a blank piece of paper, picking up his pen and putting it down again. Picking it up, putting it down, trying to decide whether he was the kind of man who did the right thing when it cost him something. He had not yet answered that question, but he was beginning to think he might have to. Viscount Harley arrived on a Thursday. Alina knew he was coming before Simmons, the butler, had finished announcing him. She had heard the carriage from her room, had looked down from the window and seen the crest on the door, and had taken exactly long enough to compose her expression before descending the stairs. This was a habit she had developed early in life. In a house where things were rarely explained and often decided without her, composure was the only currency she reliably possessed. Harley was shown into the drawing room. He stood when she entered, good manners, precisely executed, and bowed with the efficiency of a man who considered such gestures a professional obligation rather than a personal one. "Miss Ashford," he said. "What a pleasure." "Lord Harley," she replied. "Please sit." She had met him before, at 2 or 3 of the larger events of the previous season, and had formed no strong opinion of him beyond a vague sense that he was the kind of man who always knew where the exits were. He was 51, she knew. A widower. His estate in Wiltshire was considerable. He had a reputation for being exacting with his staff, with his tenants, with anyone who owed him something. He sat across from her now and made pleasant conversation about the weather, about the season, about a concert he had attended the previous week. Alina responded appropriately and watched him very carefully. What she noticed was this: he did not look at her the way a man looks at a woman he finds interesting. He looked at her the way a man looks at a painting he has already purchased, assessing, yes, but no longer uncertain. The question of acquisition had been settled. He was simply deciding where to hang it. She did not know yet what that look meant. But something in her chest went very still. When he left 40 minutes later, he had said nothing concrete. No offer. No mention of her father. Just pleasantries, measured and deliberate, and a parting comment that he hoped to see her at the Grantham dinner the following week. Alina stood at the window and watched his carriage pull away. Pleasant, her mother had said. She had been pleasant. But she filed the visit away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that required further examination. Mr. Pemberton came on Saturday. If Harley had been deliberate, Pemberton was performance. He arrived with energy, with warmth, with compliments that landed just precisely enough to seem genuine. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way, well-dressed, quick to laugh, the kind of man who was very easy to like for the first 20 minutes. Alina liked him for approximately 12. Because she noticed, as Harley's gaze had gone to her, that Pemberton's gaze kept going elsewhere. To the portrait above the mantelpiece, her grandfather, the 3rd Earl, painted in his robes. To the silver on the sideboard. To the view through the window of the rear garden, which was larger than it appeared from the street. He was cataloguing. Efficiently, almost unconsciously, the way a man does when he is mentally calculating the value of a room. He was charming to her, but he was paying attention to everything except her. When he finally rose to leave, he paused in the doorway and said, with his most genuine smile of the afternoon, "Your family has a remarkable house, Miss Ashford. Remarkable history. A man would be proud to be connected to it. Not to you." "How kind," Alina said, and smiled back with equal precision, and closed the door behind him, and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the latch. She thought about that phrase for the rest of the afternoon. Connected to it. The lawyer came on Monday. He did not ask for a leaner. He asked for her father, was shown immediately into Lord Ashford's study, and the door was closed. A leaner, passing in the corridor with a book she had no intention of reading, heard the low murmur of voices and the distinct sound of papers being set on a desk. She stood outside the door for a moment. Then she went to find her mother. Lady Ashford was in the sitting room, doing needlework with the focused attention of a woman who is using her hands to avoid using her voice. She looked up when a leaner entered and then looked down again quickly, which told Alina everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. Alina sat down across from her. She did not pick up needlework. She simply sat and waited and let the silence take up space. Her mother's needle moved. Once, twice. "Who is the man in father's study?" Alina asked. "A business associate. He arrived with a document case. Many business associates do." "Mother," the needle stopped. Lady Ashford set her work down in her lap and looked at her daughter with an expression Alina had not seen on her face before, or rather, had seen before but had always misread. She had always thought it was worry. Now, looking more carefully, she understood it was something closer to guilt. "Your father," her mother began and then stopped. "He is managing some difficulties. It is being handled." "What kind of difficulties?" "Financial." The word came out quietly, as though saying it softly might reduce its size. There have been pressures for some time that we have been working to resolve." Alina felt something cold move through her. "How long?" Her mother did not answer. "How long, mother?" "Some years," Lady Ashford said, finally, to her needlework. They are significant. Your father has been in negotiation with several parties to find a resolution." "And these callers," Alina said slowly. "Harley, Pemberton, the man in the study today." Her mother's hands tightened in her lap. "Are they part of this resolution?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. And Alina, sitting very still in the sitting room of the house she had grown up in, felt the specific and terrible sensation of a floor she had always trusted beginning to shift beneath her feet. Her mother said, "Alina, your father only wants what is best for." "Are they," Alina said, "part of the resolution? Yes or no?" Lady Ashford looked up. Her eyes were bright. "He is trying to protect the family." Which was not yes, but was not no either. And Alina had lived in this house long enough to know that the things her mother could not say directly were often more important than the things she could. She stood. She smoothed her skirts. She said very calmly, "Thank you, mother," and left the room. She found the note that afternoon. She had gone to intercept Simmons before he could sort the post, a thing she had never done before, and which required a brief, pleasant lie about expecting a letter from a friend. And it was there among the cards and correspondence, small and separate, with no seal and no return address. Just her name on the outside, written in an unfamiliar hand. Careful, economical lettering. The hand of someone who chose their words deliberately. She opened it in the corridor, before she had fully decided whether she should. There were 7 words inside. "Do not agree to anything until we speak." No signature. No explanation. No indication of who had written it or how they had known to send it here to her, and not to her father. Alina read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it inside the cover of the book she was still carrying, the one she had never intended to read. She stood in the corridor of her father's house, with a lawyer still behind one closed door and her mother still behind another, and 3 men who had come calling in the past week for reasons no one would explain to her plainly, and 7 words from a stranger that frightened her more than any of it. Not because they were threatening, because they were honest. Someone somewhere knew something. And that someone had looked at this situation and decided that she, not her father, not her mother, not a solicitor or a family friend or anyone else, she needed to know it first. The question was why. The second question, and this one was quieter and sat lower in her chest, was what exactly she had come so close to agreeing to without ever having been asked. Alina found him on a Wednesday. It had taken her 4 days, 4 days of thinking carefully about the note, about the handwriting, about the fact that whoever had written it had delivered it personally rather than through the post. Which meant they knew the house. Which meant they had been close enough to hand it to someone, Simmons, most likely, who collected the morning correspondence from the front step. Which meant they had been standing on her street early in the morning with a note already written. Already decided. Someone who had planned it. Someone who had hesitated and then done it anyway. She thought about Harley's visit. The way he had looked at her. She thought about Pemberton cataloging the silver. She thought about the lawyer behind her father's closed door and her mother's hands tightening in her lap. And then she thought about who, in all of this, had something to lose by warning her. She sent a message to Lady Grantham's secretary confirming her attendance at Thursday's dinner. And then, while her mother was resting and her father was out, she asked Simmons, with the particular casualness she had been practicing since girlhood, whether anyone had come to the door in the past fortnight aside from the expected callers. Simmons, who had been with the family for 19 years and was loyal to the house, rather than specifically to Lord Ashford, considered the question for a moment. "One gentleman, miss. Last Tuesday, very early. Said he had a note for you personally. Young man. Well-dressed, but not a gentleman caller, if you understand me. More of a professional type. Did he give a name?" "Calloway, miss. He didn't ask to come in." Alina thanked him pleasantly and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about that name until she recognized it. She had heard it once, peripherally, at the edge of a conversation at the Whitmore reception 3 months ago. Someone had said, she pressed the memory until it came clear, someone had said that Harley had taken on a new secretary. A Calloway. Second son of someone or other, Shropshire family, very capable, very quiet. Harley's secretary. He worked for Harley. He had been in that room. And he had written her a note that Harley must never see. Alina sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up, went to her writing desk and began to think about bookshops. There was one on Marwick Street that she visited legitimately enough that an appearance there would raise no particular comment. She had an account, she went perhaps twice a month, and the owner, a small, distracted man named Mr. Fenn, knew her well enough to greet her by name and leave her alone, which was precisely the combination she required. She sent a reply to the address she had found in Harley's publicly listed household directory, not to Harley, but to the secretarial office, marked simply C, with a time and a location and nothing else. If he didn't come, she would know she had misread everything. If he did come, she would know she had not. He was already there when she arrived. She recognized him immediately, though she had never spoken to him. He was standing near the back of the shop with a book he was clearly not reading, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and is no longer certain it was the right thing to rehearse. He was younger than she had expected. Taller. There was nothing remarkable about his face except that it was honest, not open, not easy, but honest in the way of someone who has found deception effortful and has largely given it up as impractical. He was dressed neatly, but without extravagance. His coat had been brushed recently and carefully. Alina walked to the shelf nearest him and appeared to examine the titles. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly without looking at him. "Miss Ashford," he said. He had a low voice. Controlled. "You have something to tell me." It was not a question. He seemed to register that, and to decide that directness suited the situation better than preamble. "Yes," he said. And then he told her. He spoke quietly and without embellishment, which she would later understand was simply how he communicated, not coldness, but a kind of respect for the weight of information. He did not soften it. He did not apologize before each sentence. He simply told her what had happened on the night of the 14th of November, from the moment Lord Ashford had arrived to the moment his carriage had pulled away, and he told it in the order it had occurred, which meant she understood not just what had been done but how quickly, and how easily, and with how little hesitation. Her father had promised her hand to Viscount Harley, then to Mr. Pemberton, then through the lawyer Griggs, to a third party whose name James did not yet know. All three on the same evening. All three in exchange for debt relief. All three recorded in a ledger that James himself had written. Alina listened. She did not interrupt. She did not move from her position beside the bookshelf, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance, and she was quiet for long enough afterward that James said, carefully, "Miss Ashford." "I'm here," she said. "I'm thinking." He waited. This, she noted, he did well the waiting. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or qualification. He simply let her think. After a moment she said, "All three promises are currently active." "Yes." Meaning three men believe they have a legitimate claim. "That is my understanding of the situation." "And my father," she stopped. Started again. "My father has not told me." "No. Nor has my mother." This came out flatter than she intended. James said nothing, which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. She turned to look at him then directly, for the first time since she had entered the shop. He met her eyes without flinching, which she appreciated. Men, she had found, often looked away when they had delivered difficult news, as though the difficulty now belonged to her alone, and they preferred not to witness her carrying it. He did not look away. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, as though he had been expecting it but had not yet settled on an answer he found fully satisfactory. "Because someone should have," he said. It was a simple answer. It was also, she realized, a complete one. It did not dress itself up as nobility or obligation or strategy. Someone should have told her. No one had. He had decided to be that someone. That was all. She held his gaze for a moment longer. "You work for Harley?" "Yes." This conversation, if he knew of it, would end my employment. "Yes. And yet." "And yet," he agreed quietly. Alina looked back at the shelf. She pulled out a book she had no interest in and opened it, because she needed something to do with her hands, and she stood there for a moment reading nothing and thinking very hard. "The ledger," she said finally. "The one you wrote. Where is it?" "Harley's study." "Locked." "And Griggs, the lawyer. You don't know who he represents?" "Not yet. I have been making inquiries." A pause. Carefully, she looked at him again. "You've been making inquiries." He met her eyes without expression. "I wrote the ledger. I have been thinking about that for 3 weeks." She went home directly afterward, walking the long way, which gave her time. The fury had arrived quietly, the way cold does not all at once, but settling, layer by layer, into the bones. She was not surprised precisely. She was not even hurt in the way she might have expected. What she felt was something cleaner and more focused than hurt. It was the specific anger of someone who has suspected for a long time that they were being managed, and has now received confirmation, in writing, witnessed, recorded in a ledger. She had been promised. 3 times. Like a parcel. Like a piece of furniture. Like an item that could be offered and reoffered, without troubling itself about where it ended up. She climbed the steps of Ashford House, nodded to Simmons, and went directly to her father's study. He was not there. She had timed it that way. She stood in front of his desk for a moment. Then she opened the top drawer. Then the second. Then in the third, behind a bundle of household receipts and a bottle of ink that had never been opened, she found the first of the debt letters. Then another. Then another. She spread them on the desk and read them in the thin afternoon light. They went back 4 years. 4 years of letters. 4 years of mounting numbers, of payment arrangements made and broken, of creditors becoming gradually less polite, and then significantly less polite, of a house conducting itself as though nothing were wrong while quietly, steadily, being eaten from the inside. 4 years. She stood there for a long moment with the letters in her hands, and then she put them back, exactly as she had found them, and closed each drawer, and straightened the receipts, and left the study as though she had never been in it. She went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk. And for the first time in her 22 years, Eleanor Ashford stopped waiting to be told what was happening in her own life, and began to decide what she was going to do about it. It was only later, when the candle had burned low and the house had gone quiet, that the second thing arrived, the quieter thing, the one she had not expected. She thought about James Calloway standing in the back of a bookshop with a book he was not reading, having written a note he could not sign, having rehearsed something he then chose not to say, having simply told her the truth in a low, steady voice and waited for her to think. She thought about what it had cost him. And she thought briefly, just once, before she set it aside and turned back to the problem at hand, that she had been in the company of 3 men who believed they had won something, and one who had simply, quietly, given something away. Eleanor did not panic. This was not bravery, exactly, it was temperament. She had grown up in a house where the adults performed calm, while chaos gathered beneath the floorboards, and she had learned early that panic was a luxury that changed nothing and cost everything. So she did not panic. She sat with what she knew, turned it over carefully, and looked at it from each side until she understood its shape. What she knew was this: 3 men believed they held a claim on her future. Each of them thought the others did not exist. Her father had created this situation out of desperation, and had apparently decided that the best way to manage it was to say nothing and hope it resolved itself, which was, she reflected, entirely consistent with how he had managed the debts for 4 years. Her mother knew enough to be guilty and not enough, or not willing enough to be useful. And there was a ledger, locked in Harley's study, that contained all of it in careful handwriting. What she also knew, and this was the part she turned over most carefully, was that each of these 3 men wanted something specific. Not her specifically. Something she represented, or something she was connected to, or something she could be used to obtain. Which meant that each of them had a weakness built into their wanting. A want that precise was also a vulnerability that precise. She simply needed to understand each one clearly enough to find it. So she made a plan. And then, because the situation required it, she did something she had never done before in her life. She began to perform. She accepted Harley's invitation to the Grantham dinner. He was there when she arrived, and she saw the small movement of satisfaction that crossed his face when he noticed her, quickly suppressed, but there. He was not a man who expected to be disappointed. This, Alina thought, taking her seat, was the first thing worth knowing about him. She was pleasant. She was attentive. She asked him questions about his estate in Wiltshire, carefully chosen questions, the kind that invited a man to talk about himself at length while revealing, to someone paying close attention, considerably more than he intended. He spoke about Wiltshire with the possessiveness of a man who defined himself entirely by what he owned. The land, the house, the tenants, the management of it all, he described these things with a satisfaction that was almost physical. Alina listened and nodded, and occasionally said something that suggested she found this admirable, and watched his eyes. He mentioned his late wife once briefly, and moved on so quickly that Alina almost missed it. But she did not miss it. She filed it away. He mentioned, with careful casualness, a property he had recently acquired in the north, a house that had belonged to a family now much reduced in circumstance. He described the acquisition with the same satisfaction he brought to everything he owned. "You have a talent for acquiring things," Alina said pleasantly. "I have a talent for recognizing value," he corrected, and looked at her in that way again, the painting on the wall, the acquisition already made. Alina smiled and changed the subject. She left the dinner, knowing two things she had not known before. The first was that Harley's finances, despite appearances, were more complicated than they seemed. The northern property acquisition had been mentioned in a way that suggested it had required some arrangement, some negotiation, some assistance from a party he had not named. The second was something James had said briefly in the bookshop: "I have been making inquiries." She had not fully understood what he meant at the time. She was beginning to understand now. She managed Pemberton differently. She encountered him, apparently by chance, at a gallery exhibition the following week, an encounter she had arranged by the simple mechanism of learning his social calendar and appearing at the right address. He was delighted to see her. Of course he was. He offered his arm immediately, and she took it, and they walked through the gallery together while she asked him about himself with the kind of attentive interest that men like Pemberton found irresistible because they so rarely had to work for it. He talked freely. This was the essential difference between Pemberton and Harley. Harley was careful, deliberate, revealed nothing he had not decided to reveal. Pemberton was the opposite. He was a man who had charmed his way through life, and had consequently never developed the habit of guarding his words, because charm had always been sufficient. Within 20 minutes, Alina had learned that his family's money was largely gone, spent by his father, managed badly by himself, maintained in appearance by a series of increasingly creative financial arrangements. That his ambitions were genuine, but his resources were not. That he had been looking for some time for a connection to a family with what he called historical weight, a name, a title, a lineage that could lend legitimacy to his own aspirations. "The Ashford name is extraordinary," he said, pausing before a landscape he was not looking at. 400 years of history. That kind of thing, you can't manufacture it. You either have it or you don't. "No," Alina agreed gently. "You can't manufacture it." She went home and sat with what she had learned. Pemberton wanted the Ashford name. The prestige of it, the history, the social architecture of 4 centuries. But the Ashford name, at this precise moment, was attached to an estate drowning in debt, a lord who had become a liability, and a social standing that was maintained entirely by the fact that the extent of the damage was not yet publicly known. If Pemberton understood what the Ashford name was currently worth, in practical terms, in financial terms, in the cold arithmetic of what a man actually acquired when he married into it, his interest would evaporate. Not slowly. Immediately. She thought about that for a long time. The third man was the most difficult, because she could not meet him. Griggs, the lawyer, had not returned to the house. He communicated exclusively through correspondence addressed to her father, which meant Alina had to intercept it, a thing she accomplished through a combination of early rising and a quiet arrangement with Simmons that she chose not to examine too carefully in terms of its ethics. The letters were formal and dry, and revealed very little beyond the fact that the client was growing impatient and required a confirmation of timeline. They were signed only Griggs on behalf of E.E. She stared at that initial for a long time. It was on the fourth letter, read in the gray light of early morning in the corridor outside her father's study, that she noticed something she had missed in the previous three. The address at the top of Griggs's letterhead. A street in Chancery Lane, unremarkable. But below it, very small, a secondary notation, acting in matters pertaining to the Hartwell estate. The Hartwell estate. She knew that name. Everyone with any knowledge of the country's larger land arrangements knew that name, or had known it, 20 years ago, when the Earl of Hartwell had been one of the most significant landholders in the southern counties. But the Earl was old now, and ill, and the estate had been in some form of legal dispute for the better part of a decade, ever since questions had arisen about the boundary lines between Hartwell land and the adjacent Ashford property. Adjacent Ashford property. Alina set the letter down very carefully. The third man did not want her at all. He had never wanted her. She was not the point, she was the mechanism. If she married the Earl's representative, the Ashford land would pass into the Hartwell estate's control through the marriage settlement, resolving the boundary dispute in Hartwell's favor without the cost or exposure of a court case. She was not a bride. She was a legal instrument. She refolded the letter, replaced it exactly as she had found it, and stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall. Then she thought about what James had told her in the bookshop. "I have been making inquiries." She needed to speak to him again. She sent the note to the same address. Same format. A different bookshop this time. She was not so impractical as to use the same location twice. He came. He looked, she thought, slightly more tired than the last time, the careful kind of tired that a person tries to conceal, but that shows itself in the set of the mouth, in the economy of movement. She wondered how much of his energy was going into the inquiries he had mentioned, and how much into conducting his normal work for Harley while doing so. She told him what she had found about Griggs and Hartwell. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That confirms something. You know who the client is." "I suspected. The Earl of Hartwell has been corresponding with Harley for some months. I transcribed several of those letters myself. At the time I thought it was simply a social connection. Now I think Harley may have brokered the arrangement with Griggs as part of a broader." He stopped. "It doesn't matter. The point is that Hartwell wants the land, not the marriage." "You're correct. Which means if the land cannot be transferred through the marriage settlement, the arrangement is worthless to him." James looked at her. "Can it be transferred?" "Not without my signature on the settlement deed. And a settlement deed requires my willing participation, which is a thing I am not currently willing to provide." She paused. "That's the mechanism for Hartwell. For Pemberton, the mechanism is the Ashford name, which is currently worth considerably less than he believes it to be." James was quiet for a moment. "And Harley?" Alina considered. "Harley is different. Harley wanted the debt cleared, which it has been, but he also wants something else. Something he hasn't named. You said you had been making inquiries." He looked at her steadily. Then he said, "There is a woman. In the country, Gloucestershire." She has been resident in a house that Harley owns for approximately 6 years. She has 2 children. The elder is 5 years old. The drawing room at Ashford House appeared in Alina's mind, Harley's careful posture, his controlled expression, the brief mention of his late wife that he had moved past so quickly. "He's married," she said. "He was. His wife died 4 years ago." But the woman in Gloucestershire, James paused. "The arrangement predates the wife's death by at least 2 years. And his finances, I have found evidence, in correspondence I have processed for him, that a significant portion of his income is directed toward maintaining that household. Which is why, despite the size of his estate, he requires your father's debt payment. He needs the liquidity." Alina was quiet for a moment. "If this were known," she said carefully, "it would end him socially." "Yes. He is already navigating the requirements of respectability. A second family hidden is the kind of thing that, once known, cannot be unknown. You found all of this." "Some of it I already knew. Some I found." He said it without particular pride, as a statement of fact. Alina looked at him. He was standing very still, in the careful way he had, as though he had learned somewhere that stillness was a form of reliability. She thought about what it had taken, the time, the risk, the quiet, sustained effort of a man who had no obligation to do any of it. "Why," she said for the second time, "are you still helping me?" He met her eyes. And again he was quiet for a moment before he answered, not because he didn't know, she thought, but because he was being precise. "Because you haven't stopped," he said. "Most people, receiving the news you received, would have wept, or confronted their father, or resigned themselves to one of the 3. You are systematically dismantling the situation instead. I find that," he stopped. "You find it what?" she said. He looked away for the first time. "Worth helping," he said. It was not quite what he had been going to say. Alina noted that, and set it aside, and returned to the problem at hand. The crisis came the following Thursday. She did not know about it immediately. She learned it the way she had learned most things in the past weeks, through inference and interception. A letter from Harley to her father, written in a tone that had moved beyond courtesy into something with an edge to it. A reference to a timeline that had not been honored. A sentence near the end that made Alina's jaw tighten when she read it standing in the corridor at 6 in the morning. "I am no longer prepared to wait for Miss Ashford's calendar to align with your convenience. The matter should be concluded within the month. I trust you will make the necessary arrangements, or I will be obliged to make them myself. Within the month." Alina folded the letter, replaced it, and stood very still for a moment in the gray morning light of the corridor. Then she went to her writing desk and wrote 2 notes. The first was to James Calloway. The second, the one that cost her more to write, the one she sat over for a long time before she finally put pen to paper, was to herself. A list, precise and unsentimental, of everything she had and everything she needed, and the single thing that stood between her plan and its execution. She needed proof. Written, documented, irrefutable proof of Harley's hidden family, of Pemberton's true financial position, of Hartwell's land-driven motivation. The kind of proof that could not be argued away or laughed off, or managed with charm and social pressure. The kind of proof that lived in a locked study. Harley's locked study. She stared at the list for a long time. Then she wrote James's name at the bottom of it, and underlined it once, and set down her pen. James received Alina's note on a Friday morning. He read it at his desk in the small anteroom outside Harley's study, where he spent the majority of his working hours transcribing correspondence, managing appointments, and performing the 100 quiet tasks that kept a viscount's household running with the kind of efficiency its owner took entirely for granted. He read it once, folded it, placed it inside the cover of the ledger he kept for household accounts, and continued working. He read it again at noon. He did not send a reply. The note had not asked him directly. This was the thing he kept returning to. She had not written "will you" or "I need you to" or anything that placed the decision explicitly in his hands, as a request he could accept or refuse. She had written only what she needed, and why, and what it would make possible. And then she had written at the very end, in the same precise hand, "I will not ask you to do this. I am telling you because you have a right to know what the situation requires. Whatever you decide, I will find another way." He had read that last sentence 4 times. "I will find another way." He believed her. That was the difficulty. He believed her completely, believed that she would find another way, would sit with the problem until she had turned it into something manageable, would not collapse or appeal or wait to be rescued. She had not waited once in the entire time he had known her, which meant that if he did nothing, she would do something else. Something that cost her more, most likely. Something that required her to expose herself further, to take risks that a woman in her position could not easily survive if they went wrong. He thought about that on Friday afternoon and Friday evening, and through most of Friday night. On Saturday morning he got up, dressed carefully, and went to work. Harley was not in the house. This was not an accident. James had managed Harley's calendar for 14 months and knew his movements with the precision of a man whose professional survival depended on it. Saturday mornings, without variation, Harley was at his club. He left at 9:30 and returned no earlier than 1. The household staff were occupied with their weekly routines. The study would be empty for 3 hours. James had a key to the study. This was part of his position. He was trusted with access to Harley's correspondence, his filing systems, the locked cabinets that contained the household's more sensitive documents. He had been given this access because Harley had assessed him as reliable and incurious. He had been reliable. The incurious part had been, James reflected, something of an overestimation on Harley's part. He unlocked the study door, closed it behind him, and stood for a moment in the silence. The room smelled of leather and coal smoke, and the particular dry scent of old paper. The curtains were half drawn. Morning light came through in a long pale stripe across the desk, which was large and dark, and occupied the center of the room with the authority of everything else Harley owned. James went to the filing cabinet on the left wall first. He had processed the contents of this cabinet regularly. He knew what was here and what wasn't, and he worked quickly, with the methodical efficiency of someone who had planned this in advance. The Ashford correspondence was in the 3rd drawer, in a folder labeled with a date rather than a name, Harley's preferred system, and one James had designed himself, which gave him a particular grim advantage now. He opened the folder and went through it page by page, removing what he needed. The original promise, signed by Lord Ashford in the specific circumstances of the card game. Beneath it, a subsequent letter in which Harley had outlined his expectations. Beneath that, correspondence with his solicitor about the structure of the proposed marriage contract. He set these aside and moved to the locked drawer at the bottom of the cabinet. He had a key for this too. He had been given it 6 months ago to file a specific document and had been asked to return it. He had returned a copy. The original he had kept for no reason he could have articulated at the time, and for a very clear reason now. The locked drawer contained personal correspondence. He had never opened it in an official capacity. He opened it now and went through it without allowing himself to hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury he had already used up the night before. The letters from Gloucestershire were there. A dozen of them, at least, written in a woman's hand, addressed to Harley by his first name, which Alina had likely never heard anyone use. They were not incriminating in their content, exactly. They were domestic, careful, the letters of a woman managing a household and raising children and writing with the deliberate restraint of someone who understood the terms of her situation. But they were there. They were dated. They overlapped by 2 years with the period of Harley's marriage. Beneath the letters, a series of bank drafts. Regular, substantial, made out to a household in Gloucestershire. Dated quarterly, going back 7 years. James took what he needed, left what he didn't, and locked the drawer. The financial records were in the second cabinet, and these required more time. Harley's finances were, on the surface, the finances of a prosperous man. Below the surface, they were the finances of a man who had been sustaining 2 households and several complex arrangements simultaneously for nearly a decade, and who had managed to do so by means of a series of transactions that were not individually suspicious, but collectively told a story that a competent solicitor, or a careful secretary who had been transcribing correspondence for 14 months, could read with some clarity. James did not take everything. He took enough. Enough to demonstrate that Harley's interest in the Ashford debt had been financial necessity dressed as generosity. Enough to demonstrate that the promised sum had not come from Harley's own reserves, but from a loan secured against his Wiltshire estate, a detail that made the proposed marriage contract significantly more complicated in legal terms, because it meant Harley was offering Alina's father relief with money he did not technically possess in the way the agreement implied. He worked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He was precise and he was thorough, and he did not think too carefully about what he was doing, because thinking too carefully about it would have introduced a hesitation he could not afford. When he was finished, he locked everything that should be locked, replaced everything that should be replaced, and left the room exactly as he had found it. He went to his desk, sat down, and looked at the documents in his hands for a moment. Then he put them in his coat, stood up, and went to find a bookshop. She was already there when he arrived. She had chosen well, a small place on a quiet street, the kind that attracted browsers rather than buyers, where 2 people could stand near the back for 20 minutes without attracting comment. She was examining a shelf with the focused attention she brought to everything, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that asked the question before she did. He reached into his coat and held out the documents. She took them. She went through them quickly, page by page, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent weeks reading her father's correspondence in pre-dawn corridors. Her face did not change. He had noticed this about her, that her face was a choice she made, not a reflex she managed. She decided what it showed. When she reached the letters from Gloucestershire, she was still for a moment. Then she set them behind the financial records and continued. When she was done, she squared the papers carefully, held them in both hands and looked at him. "This is everything," she said. It was not a question. "It's enough," he said. "For all 3. Harley, yes. Pemberton, I've included a note from a solicitor I found in his correspondence with your father. He wrote to Ashford 3 weeks ago requesting a delay because his own financial situation required. He used the phrase temporary consolidation, which is the language men use when they are out of money. In Hartwell." James reached into his coat again and produced a single page. "A letter from Griggs to Harley. They have been in communication, as I suspected. Griggs was using Harley's social connection to your father as a parallel avenue of pressure. This letter makes Hartwell's actual interest explicit. The land boundary. Nothing else." Alina read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked up, and he saw something in her face that he had not seen before in their interactions. Not the cold fury of the morning she had gone through her father's papers, not the focused precision with which she had approached every meeting. Something quieter than that. Something that might, in a woman less composed, have been called relief. "This is everything," she said again. "James." It was the first time she had used his name. He registered it in the way that one registers a small thing that is not small. "You will be dismissed," she said. It was not a question either, but there was something in the way she said it, a weight, a recognition, that was different from her earlier observations about the cost to him. Earlier she had stated it factually. Now she said it as though she had been carrying it. "Yes," he said. "When he finds out." When he finds out, she was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. And then, because it was true and he had decided to say it, "I would do it again." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze and did not qualify it. Then she looked back at the documents. "I have 3 visits to make," she said. "I would like to make them tomorrow. While the advantage is still mine. All 3 in one day. If I wait, Harley may notice something is missing. Pemberton may receive a better offer elsewhere. And Griggs will send another letter to my father that my father will panic over and mismanage." She paused. "One day." All 3, he thought about this. "In what order?" "Pemberton first. He's the simplest. The information itself will end his interest without requiring me to deploy it. Then Hartwell's lawyer. Then Harley." She said the last name with a particular flatness. "Harley will be angry," James said. "Yes. He may go to your father directly." "My father," Eleanor said, with a composure that cost something, "no longer has the authority to conclude this on my behalf. That is what I intend to make clear." James was quiet for a moment. "Will he accept that?" "He will when I explain the alternative." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to tell me it's too dangerous?" "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you to be careful." "I am always careful." "I know," he said. "Be more careful than usual." She was gone from Pemberton's drawing room in under 30 minutes. She had not needed the documents. She had needed only 3 sentences, delivered pleasantly. Over tea she did not drink. A precise and accurate description of the Ashford estate's current financial position, its debt obligations, and the realistic market value of the Ashford name in its present circumstances. She watched Pemberton's face as she spoke with the detached attention of a scientist observing a reaction, and she saw the exact moment his interest in her transformed into a calculation, and the calculation came up short. He was gracious about it, to his credit. He said something about a prior commitment he had overlooked, a matter that required his attention elsewhere. Eleanor expressed her understanding. They parted on perfectly cordial terms. She was in her carriage before he had finished closing the door. Griggs received her in his Chancery Lane office with visible uncertainty. She had sent no appointment. She had simply arrived, given her name, and waited. He came out to her after 7 minutes, she counted, and showed her into a room that smelled of documents and equivocation. She placed the letter on his desk, the one in which his client's intentions were made explicit. She said, "I understand your client's interest in the Ashford land boundary. I would like you to convey to him that I am aware of the mechanism by which he intended to resolve it, and that I find it both legally insufficient and personally objectionable. The mechanism requires my signature. I will not provide it." Griggs looked at the letter, then at her, then at the letter again. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "if your client would like to pursue the boundary matter through legitimate legal channels, he is welcome to do so. It will be expensive, it will be public, and the Ashford solicitors will contest it vigorously." She paused. Or he may choose to drop it. That would be my recommendation. She stood, collected the letter, and left. On the pavement outside, she stood for a moment in the cold air and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of something that was not quite triumph, but was adjacent to it. Then she got back in the carriage and went to see Harley. He received her in his drawing room with the careful courtesy of a man who has decided to be charming and has not yet been given a reason to stop. Eleanor sat. She declined tea. She placed the documents on the low table between them and left her hand resting on top of them for a moment before she spoke. "Lord Harley," she said, "I would like to discuss the evening of the 14th of November." She watched his face change. It was a small change, almost nothing. In a man less controlled it would have been nothing, but she saw it. The slight recalibration. The reassessment. "I see," he said. "I believe you do," she said. "I have here the documentation of my father's promise, made under circumstances that a competent solicitor would describe as legally compromised, intoxication, financial coercion, and the simultaneous existence of 2 other promises made that same evening, which renders any single promise considerably less enforceable than you may have believed." Harley was very still. "I also have," she continued, "documentation of a household in Gloucestershire, maintained at your expense for the past 7 years, and the financial records that demonstrate the source of the funds you used to clear my father's debt." She paused. "I have no interest in making any of this public. I have no particular desire to cause you difficulty." "Then what," Harley said in a voice that had gone very quiet, "do you want?" "I want you to withdraw your claim," she said. "Formally in writing, through your solicitor. I want a letter delivered to my father within the week stating that you have reconsidered the arrangement and find it no longer suitable. No explanation required. Men withdraw from arrangements all the time. No one will ask questions you cannot answer." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes without difficulty. "And if I refuse," he said, "then I will be obliged to consult a solicitor of my own about the enforceability of promises made under duress, which will require me to submit these documents as evidence, which will require them to be read by at least 3 people who do not currently know their contents." She paused. "I don't think you want that. And I don't want it either. It would be much simpler if you withdrew." The room was very quiet. Harley looked at the documents on the table between them. He looked at her. He looked at the documents again. Then he said, "You are 22 years old." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Your father has no idea you are here." "My father," she said, "is not here." "I am." Another silence. Longer this time. "The letter," he said finally, "will be with your father by Friday." Eleanor stood, collected the documents, and inclined her head precisely as much as the situation required. "Thank you, Lord Harley," she said. "I hope the rest of your season is agreeable." She was home before 4. Her father was in the drawing room when she arrived, which she had not planned for. He looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who has been sitting with his thoughts for too long and has not enjoyed the company. "Eleanor," he said, "where have you been?" She looked at him for a moment, this man in his fine coat, with his careful cravat, who had sat across a card table and given her away 3 times in one evening and come home and kissed her mother good night. She had thought about this moment. She had planned what she would say, measured, precise, neither cruel nor forgiving, simply true. What she said was, "I have been resolving your difficulties, father. You may expect letters from all 3 parties within the week." He stared at her. "I would suggest," she continued, "that when they arrive, you simply acknowledge them and do not attempt to renegotiate. The matter is concluded." "What have you done?" he said. His voice was very strange. "What you should have done," Eleanor said. protected this family. She went upstairs. She closed her door. She sat on the edge of her bed in her outdoor clothes and looked at the wall for a long time. The thing was done. All three of them. In one day, as she had planned. The promises her father had made were broken. The men had been managed. The documents were in her possession. The situation was resolved. She had won. And James Calloway, at this precise moment, was sitting at a desk in Harley's house with 14 months of careful, quiet work behind him and no idea yet that it was about to end. Because Harley would discover the missing documents, and Harley would know immediately who had taken them, and James would not lie about it. Alina knew this because she knew him, now, well enough to know that he would not lie about it. He would simply take what came. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about that for a long time. She had won, and the winning felt almost complete. Almost. James was dismissed on the following Tuesday. He did not tell Alina directly. She found out through a note, brief, factual, written in the same economical hand as the first one he had ever sent her, which said only that his position with Lord Harley had concluded, and he had secured a temporary arrangement with a shipping firm on Aldgate Street. She read the note 3 times. Temporary arrangement. She put it in the drawer of her writing desk and went downstairs to dinner and was pleasant and composed and said all the right things. Her mother had noticed in the past week that something had shifted, not in Alina's manner, which remained as measured as ever, but in the quality of her presence. As though she had taken up more space. Her mother had not asked about it, which was perhaps the wisest thing she had done in months. After dinner, Alina went back upstairs. She took out the note and read it a 4th time. Temporary arrangement. She thought about James Calloway standing in a shipping firm's office on Aldgate Street, managing accounts for someone who did not know what he was capable of, who had not watched him dismantle a locked cabinet with a copied key and steady hands, and the quiet certainty of a man who had decided to do the right thing, and was doing it without making a performance of it. She thought about what she had said to him in the bookshop, "I will find another way," and how he had not let her. She thought about his face when she had said, "I'm sorry," and the way he had said, "Don't be," and then, "I would do it again." She had set that aside at the time. She had set it aside several times since. There was always something more immediately pressing. The visits, the documents, her father in the drawing room, the letters to wait for, the situation to conclude. The situation was concluded. There was nothing left to set aside. Alina sat at her writing desk for a long time. The candle burned. Outside, the street was quiet. She thought about 3 men who had believed, for a matter of weeks, that they had won something. She thought about one man who had given something away. She picked up her pen. She put it down. She thought, he won't accept it. He'll say he has nothing to offer. He'll say I've just freed myself from men who wanted to own me, and he won't be the 4th. She thought, I know him well enough to know exactly what he'll say. She picked up the pen again. She thought, good. Then I'll know what to say back. She began to write. She found him on a Thursday morning. Not through a note this time. She had written the note and then sat with it for 2 days and understood, finally, that some things required a person to simply appear. Notes could be not replied to. Doors could be not answered. A woman standing on a pavement in the cold November air was considerably harder to avoid than ink on paper, and Alina had not come this far by choosing the easier approach when the more direct one was available. The shipping firm on Aldgate Street was not what she had imagined, though she was not certain what she had imagined. A narrow building, 3 stories, a sign above the door that was practical rather than decorative. The kind of establishment that conducted its business without requiring anyone to be impressed by it. She stood outside it for a moment in her good coat, which was perhaps too good for Aldgate Street but which she had worn deliberately. Not for vanity, but because she had learned in the past weeks that appearance was information, and she wanted to be legible. She went in. The clerk at the front desk was young and visibly uncertain about what to do with her. She gave him James's name and said she was a private caller on a personal matter, in the tone she had discovered made people move without requiring further explanation. He moved. She waited in the small anteroom, which smelled of salt and timber and old invoices, and looked at the opposite wall and thought about what she was going to say. She had thought about it for 2 days. She had several versions. The precise one, the one that laid out her reasoning in the logical sequence she found most natural. The shorter one, for if he tried to end the conversation before it properly began. The one she had written down and then burned because it had been too careful, too constructed, too much like a legal argument and not enough like the truth. She had settled in the end on the truth. It was what he had given her the first time. It seemed appropriate to return it. He appeared in the doorway after 4 minutes. He had not been expecting her. She could see that immediately, the slight arrest in his movement, the fraction of a second in which he was simply still, before the composure she had come to recognize settled back into place. He was in his shirt sleeves, which meant she had interrupted actual work, and he looked, she found the word without difficulty, diminished. Not defeated. Not unhappy exactly. But smaller than he should be. Occupying less space than he was capable of occupying, in the way of a person who has adjusted their dimensions to fit a room that is too small for them, and has begun to forget they ever fit differently. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "I would like to speak with you. I won't take long." He glanced back into the office. She could see, past his shoulder, a desk covered in ledgers and a window that looked onto a brick wall, and then he said, "There's a coffee house 2 doors down. Give me a moment." She waited on the pavement. He came out 3 minutes later in his coat, and they walked the 2 doors without speaking, and he held the door for her, which she had expected, and they found a table at the back, which was where he always seemed to gravitate. She had noticed the position that allowed him to see the room without being its center. The coffee house was warm and largely empty at this hour. A woman behind the counter did not look at them. A man by the window read a newspaper and paid them no attention. They sat. Alina did not order anything. Neither did he. He sat across from her with his hands around nothing, and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over their weeks of careful meetings, attentive, still, giving her the room to begin. She began. "I came," she said, "because I owe you a conversation that I should have had before now. And because I have been finding reasons to delay it, which is not a habit I respect in myself, and I decided this morning to stop." He said nothing. He was watching her carefully. "You warned me," she said, "when you had no obligation to, and every reason not to. And then you helped me, repeatedly at cost to yourself that I observed and did not adequately. I did not address. And now you are here in a shipping firm on Aldgate Street because of choices you made on my behalf, and I am in Mayfair because of choices you made on my behalf, and that disproportion," she stopped. Began again. "That disproportion is something I think about." "Miss Ashford," he said in the careful voice, "you don't owe me anything." "I know I don't," she said. "That is not why I'm here." He was quiet. "I am here," Alina said, "because I have spent the past several weeks in the company of 3 men who each believed they had claim to something that was not theirs. And I spent that time learning what each of them actually wanted, which was, in all 3 cases, not me. The land, the name, the social architecture. I was the mechanism. Not the point. She looked at him steadily. And then there is you, she said, who wanted nothing from me, who asked for nothing, offered nothing, claimed nothing, who simply told me the truth when it cost you something, and then kept helping me when it cost you more. And I find that I cannot, she stopped. He was very still. I find that I cannot account for you, she said, in the way I can account for the others. I understand Harley. I understand Pemberton. I understand men who want things they can name and pursue them through the mechanisms available to them. I do not understand what you were doing. I have thought about it at considerable length, and I cannot produce an explanation that satisfies me. A pause. So I came to ask you, she said. Directly. The coffee house was quiet. Somewhere behind them, a cup was set down on a saucer. The man by the window turned a page. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked back at her, and she saw something shift in his face, not the composure falling exactly, but a decision being made behind it. I told you, he said, because someone should have. Yes, she said. You told me that. I'm asking why you kept going. Another silence. Longer. Because, he said slowly, as though finding the words in the order they needed to come, the situation was unjust. Plainly, straightforwardly unjust. And I had written it down in my own hand, and I could not. He stopped. I could not simply leave it there. That is why you sent the first note, Eleanor said. I believe you. But that is not why you met me in a bookshop. It is not why you spent weeks making inquiries. It is not why you went into a locked cabinet with a copied key. He was quiet. James, she said. It was the second time she had used his name. She saw him register it. Why did you keep going, she said quietly, when the injustice had already been named and I already knew? The silence this time was the longest yet. She waited in it without filling it, the way he had always waited for her, and she watched his face with the attention she had given to everything in the past weeks. Harley's drawing room, Pemberton's gallery, Griggs's office. But this time it was different, because this time she was not looking for a weakness to understand. She was looking for something else entirely. Because I wanted to, he said finally. Very quietly. Because every time I thought, this is enough, she has what she needs, I can stop, I found I couldn't. Because he stopped. He looked at the table. I have nothing to offer you, he said. The words came out differently now, lower, more careful, the words of a man who has rehearsed this part. No title. No estate. No position worth the name. The position I had is gone and my reference with it, and what I have is a temporary arrangement in a shipping firm and a rented room in Stepney, and you have just freed yourself from 3 men who believed they could own you, and I will not. He stopped again. I will not be the 4th. Whatever I feel. I will not be the 4th. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She had known he would say this. She had known it precisely, in the exact words he had used, because she had thought about this conversation for 2 days, and she knew him well enough now to know how his mind worked, the logic of it, the particular pride that dressed itself as selflessness, the genuine belief that restraint was the kindest thing he could offer her. She had known what he would say. She had also known what she would say back. You are not listening to me, she said. He looked up. I did not say I came here because I require something from you. I did not say I came here because I need to be saved, or managed, or provided for. I am not here because I have assessed your assets and found them adequate. She held his gaze. I am here because you are the only person in this entire situation who told me the truth when it cost him something. Not when it was safe. Not when it was convenient. When it cost you something real. And that. She stopped for a moment. Not because she had lost the words, because she wanted to say this one correctly. That is not a small thing, she said. That is not a minor quality in a person that I might overlook in favor of a title or an estate. That is, she exhaled quietly. In 22 years, in a house where things were managed and arranged and decided without me, I have never had a person in my life who simply told me the truth when it cost them something. Not once. And you did it immediately. And then you kept doing it. And I find that I am unwilling to. I find that I am not prepared to simply return to Mayfair and leave you in Stepney and call that the conclusion of the matter. James was very still. You said you will not be the fourth, she said. The fourth man who believed he had claim to something that was not his. And you are right. You will not be. Because I am not here to be claimed. I am here because I am choosing deliberately, with full information, with no coercion and no mechanism and no arrangement made without my knowledge. She paused. I am choosing to ask whether you would like to have dinner with me. On Thursday. At a restaurant of your choosing. As two people who know each other rather well by now and who have, between them, dismantled 3 highly inconvenient engagements, which seems like sufficient grounds for a meal. The coffee house was very quiet. James looked at her. She looked back. He said dinner. On Thursday, she said. As two people who know each other rather well, she confirmed. Something happened in his face then, not quite a smile, not yet, but the thing that comes before one, in a person who has been careful for so long that the approach of something good takes a moment to be recognized as safe. I know a place, he said slowly, in Holborn. It is not Mayfair. I have been to Mayfair, Eleanor said. I find I am not particularly attached to it. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, quietly, almost to himself, as though he had not entirely intended to say it aloud. You are the most remarkable person I have ever met. Eleanor considered this. You have met very few people outside of professional context, she said. Your sample size may be limited. He laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, and it changed his entire face. She had not heard him laugh before. She thought she would like to hear it again. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she said. She stood. He stood. They walked to the door of the coffee house and out onto the pavement of Aldgate Street, where the cold air came at them immediately, and the street was loud and ordinary and entirely unlike a drawing room or a bookshop or a locked study, and Eleanor found she did not mind at all. Miss Ashford, he said. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the coffee house with the light behind him, and he looked. She searched for the word restored, as though he had been adjusted back to his correct dimensions. Thank you, he said. For coming. Thank you, she said, for the documents. He shook his head slightly, almost smiling. That is not what I meant. I know, she said. Thursday, James. She walked back toward the main road. She did not look back, because she had made her case and stated her terms, and she was not in the habit of second-guessing herself after the fact. But she was smiling before she reached the corner. Her father was in the drawing-room when she returned home. He had aged, she thought, in the past weeks, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who has been relieved of a weight he was accustomed to carrying and does not yet know how to stand without it. The letters had arrived as she had predicted. All 3. He had sat with them in his study for a long afternoon and had not come to dinner that evening, and when he had emerged the following morning he had not spoken of them, and Eleanor had not asked him to. He looked up when she came in. You were out, he said. Yes, she said. She sat across from him, not the chair she usually chose, which was slightly to the side, slightly peripheral. the one directly opposite. I had a call to make. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before and could not immediately name. It was not guilt. She had seen his guilt and it looked like evasion. This was something else. Something quieter. "Alina," he said. "Father," she said, not unkindly. "Not today." He closed his mouth. "There will be time," she said, "for that conversation. But not today." He nodded slowly, like a man accepting terms he did not have the standing to negotiate. Alina stood. She went to the door. Then she paused with her hand on the frame, because there was one thing she wanted to say, not for cruelty, not for the satisfaction of it, but because it was true and it was important, and she thought he needed to hear it plainly. "I protected this family," she said, "as I said I would. I ask only one thing in return." He looked at her. "Next time," she said, "tell me." She went upstairs. Behind her in the drawing room, her father sat very still for a long time. The house was small. This was the first thing people noticed, the few who came to call, that it was nothing like what Alina Ashford might have been expected to occupy. No portrait gallery. No long gravel drive. No butler named Simmons, who had been with the family for 19 years. 2 stories, a garden that was more practical than ornamental, a parlor with good light in the mornings, and a study that had been divided down the middle by an unspoken but mutually understood arrangement. Her side with correspondence and household accounts, his side with shipping ledgers, and the law books he had begun acquiring with the purposeful quiet of a man who has decided what he wants to become. It was nothing like Ashford House. Alina found, every single morning, that she did not miss Ashford House at all. They had married in March. Quietly, as she had always known she would want to, not out of shame, but out of preference. A small church in Holborn, a Tuesday, 12 people in the pews. Her mother had come, which had surprised Alina and had not surprised James, who had said only when she told him, "She loves you. She simply doesn't know how to do it usefully." Alina had thought about that for a long time afterward, and had decided it was probably the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about her mother, and had been quietly grateful for it. Her father had not come. This had been Alina's decision, made carefully and without drama, and not revisited. There would be time. She had said so, and she meant it. But not yet. Lady Ashford had sat in the 3rd pew in her good grey dress, and had cried from the moment Alina appeared in the doorway until well after the register was signed, and had pressed Alina's hand afterward with both of hers and said nothing, which was, Alina had thought, the most honest thing her mother had managed in years. James had stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who could not quite believe the architecture of the moment he was standing in, and when Alina had reached him and he had looked at her, she had seen in his face the thing she had first glimpsed in a coffee house on Aldgate Street, that restored quality, the sense of a person returned to their correct dimensions, and she had thought, "Good. Stay that way." She had afterward told him this. He had laughed that short, surprised laugh she had been collecting since Thursday in Holborn and said, "I intend to." He was at the shipping firm still, but differently now. The temporary arrangement had become permanent, and the permanent arrangement had expanded, because James was, as Alina had known from the first careful note in an unfamiliar hand, exceptionally capable, and the kind of capability that is also quiet tends to be noticed eventually by people who are paying attention. The firm's senior partner had begun involving him in matters beyond accounts. There were conversations, James reported in the evenings over dinner, about a more formal role, about a future that was not temporary. He was also reading law. 2 evenings a week, at a small academy near Gray's Inn, with the focused application of a man who has decided on a direction, and sees no reason to approach it at anything less than full commitment. Alina had not suggested this. He had simply appeared one evening with a prospectus and said, "I've been thinking." She had said, "Tell me." He had told her. She had said, "When do you start?" This was, she had come to understand, the essential rhythm of their life together, not one directing and one following, not one managing and one being managed, but two people who told each other the truth about what they were thinking and then made room for it. It was a simple thing. She had not known before how rare it was. Her mother came to visit on the first Sunday of each month. These visits had begun awkwardly, in the way of things that carry the weight of what has not been said, and had gradually become something Alina would not have predicted, genuinely pleasant. Her mother sat in the good light parlor and drank tea, and talked about the small events of the Mayfair calendar, with the slightly exhausted air of a woman who has begun to suspect that the calendar may not be worth as much as she had been led to believe. Alina listened and occasionally offered observations that made her mother laugh, a sound Alina had rarely heard from her, growing up, and found she was glad to hear now. Her mother never mentioned Lord Ashford directly. Alina did not ask her to. But on the third visit in May, her mother had paused in the doorway on her way out and said, seemingly to the garden, or to no one in particular, "He is ashamed, Alina. I want you to know that. He is, it is not an excuse. But he is." Alina had considered this. "I know," she had said. Her mother had nodded once and left. Alina had stood in the doorway for a moment afterward, looking at the garden, which was not ornamental but which had, she had recently noticed, excellent soil. Viscount Harley had retired from London society in the autumn. The reasons given were vague: health, country obligations, a preference for Wiltshire that had apparently become absolute. Society, which always preferred a tidy explanation to a complicated one, had accepted this without significant inquiry. Alina heard about it through her mother and felt nothing in particular, which she considered appropriate. The woman in Gloucestershire she had thought about once or twice. She hoped in a general way that the woman's situation had improved. She had no information on this and no mechanism for obtaining it, and she had decided that hoping, in the abstract, was the extent of her responsibility. Mr. Pemberton had married a merchant's daughter from Bristol in the summer. Alina had seen the notice in the paper and read it with mild interest. He looked, in the brief account of the wedding, like a man who had made a reasonable calculation and was contentedly committed to it. She wished him no particular ill. The Earl of Hartwell's land dispute with the Ashford estate had been submitted to legal arbitration in the spring, at considerable expense to both parties, and had been resolved, as Alina had predicted to Griggs on a pavement in Chancery Lane, largely in Ashford's favor, on the grounds that the boundary documents Hartwell had relied upon were found to be incomplete. She read this in a letter from her father's solicitor, forwarded to her by her mother, and felt a satisfaction that was clean and uncomplicated. It was James who found her, on a Sunday morning in November, sitting at her side of the divided study with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a letter she had read 3 times. He came in without knocking. They had agreed early on that knocking on the study door implied a formality that neither of them wanted, and looked at her face, and then at the letter and said, "What is it?" She held it out. He read it. It was from her father. Short Lord Ashford was not a man who found written expression easy, which perhaps explained some things about the management of his household. Alina had thought more than once. Short and unpracticed, and without the social lubrication of charm that he relied upon in person. Which meant it was, almost despite itself, honest. It said that he was well. That the estate was being managed more carefully now, with assistance from a new solicitor who had been recommended to him. That he had been thinking at some length about the events of the previous year. That he did not expect forgiveness, he used that word, which Alina read twice, and did not believe he had earned it, but that he hoped she was. He had crossed out 2 words here and written another, happy. He hoped she was happy. He had signed it simply Father. James read it to the end and looked up. Well, he said. Yes, Alina said. He handed it back to her. He looked at her carefully, in the way he had, attentive, giving her the room. Are you, he said. She looked at the letter for a moment. Then she set it down on her side of the desk, in the space between the household accounts and the correspondence, and looked at her husband, at his shirt sleeves and his careful eyes, and the law book lying open on his side of the room, and the cup of tea he had brought her, which he set down now beside her hand without making a production of it. Yes, she said. I am. He nodded as though this were important information, which she supposed it was. Good, he said, and went back to his side of the desk. Alina picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway, because it had been brought to her, and looked out the window of the not ornamental garden where the November light was thin and flat and entirely ordinary, and thought about a night 1 year ago when her father had sat across a card table from 3 men and given her away, and thought about the long chain of events that had led from that night to this morning, to this room, to this divided desk, and this cold tea and this unremarkable Sunday. She had been promised to 3 men in a single evening. She had chosen one herself in the morning. She picked up her pen, turned over a fresh page, and began to write her father back. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.